Really never had something this bad with everything together.
No, I mean, the whole day has been a disaster pace-wise. So, yeah, no grip. Honestly, I think that's the biggest problem. No grip, no balance. Just losing massive amounts of time in the corners, to be honest. And then, of course, because of that, you start triggering other little problems. But the big problem for us is just the cornering is, completely out.
3 months ago, everyone believed Red Bull would dominate the new era of Formula One again. New regulations, new engines, a brand new Ford-powered project, and Max Verstappen ready to take back the championship from Lando Norris. But something shocking just happened in China. During sprint qualifying at the Chinese Grand Prix, the team that once controlled the entire grid suddenly collapsed. Max Verstappen finished 8th. His teammate Isaac Hadjar only 10th. Both Red Bulls more than 1.5 seconds away from pole position. In modern Formula One, that gap is enormous. But the real story started seconds later. Because Verstappen pressed the radio button. And what he said next immediately triggered alarm inside the paddock. The power disappeared. Not once. More than once. Which raises a question that nobody expected to ask this early in the 2026 season. Did Verstappen just expose a major problem with the Ford-powered RB22? Because when one of the most precise drivers in Formula One says the car is losing power on the straight, engineers start looking for answers. And the numbers from China make the situation even more worrying. Red Bull barely survived the early qualifying sessions. They scraped into the final round by less than 1/10 of a second. Then lost more than 1.7 seconds to pole. For a team that dominated Formula One for years, that is not just a bad session. That is a warning. A very serious warning. And by the end of this video, you will understand why that furious radio message from Verstappen might reveal something far more dangerous about the RB22 than a simple setup problem. So if you want to understand what really went wrong for Red Bull in China, and why this chaotic sprint weekend could be the beginning of a much bigger crisis, subscribe to the channel. The warning signs actually started much earlier. Before the chaos of sprint qualifying. Before the radio message. Before Verstappen's frustration reached the microphones. It started in the only practice session of the entire Chinese Grand Prix weekend. Just 1 hour. That is all the teams had. 1 hour to understand the track. 1 hour to test the new energy systems. 1 hour to prepare a setup for the rest of the weekend. And almost immediately, Red Bull realized something did not feel right. Verstappen left the garage early. Standard run plan. Medium tires. Baseline energy deployment. Nothing aggressive. Just data collection. At first, the lap times looked normal. But then the timing screen started to change. Mercedes suddenly jumped to the top. McLaren looked extremely comfortable. Even Ferrari, still adjusting to their new concept, began showing strong sector times. Meanwhile, the RB22 looked unstable. Through the long Shanghai corners, the rear of the car moved more than expected. On corner exit, the traction was inconsistent. And every time Verstappen accelerated onto a straight, there was a slight hesitation before the power arrived. Not dramatic, but noticeable. At first, engineers assumed it was simply early session calibration. After all, the 2026 regulations completely changed the power unit philosophy. Electric deployment is now a much bigger part of performance. Energy harvesting is far more aggressive. And managing that energy correctly has become one of the most complex challenges in the sport. But then the numbers began telling a different story. George Russell set the reference lap for Mercedes. And the gap appeared immediately. Huge. Almost 2 seconds faster than Verstappen at that moment. Max pushed again. New tires. Full attack. He improved. Climbing from 13th on the timing screen up to 6th. But as the session continued, other drivers kept improving. And when the practice session finally ended, Verstappen had dropped back to 8th place. His teammate Isaac Hadjar finished even further behind. 13th. Both Red Bulls almost 2 seconds away from the fastest car. Inside the Red Bull garage, the engineers were already studying the telemetry. Sector by sector. Corner by corner. And one pattern quickly became clear. The RB22 was not losing time in just one place. It was losing time everywhere. Corner entry. Mid-corner balance. And most importantly, acceleration. That last part is critical at the Shanghai International Circuit. Because the track contains one of the longest straights in the entire Formula One calendar. If the hybrid system is not deploying energy correctly, the car begins to lose speed halfway down the straight. Drivers call this clipping. The power slowly fades. Acceleration becomes weaker. And the lap time disappears. which means even a small problem in the hybrid system becomes brutally obvious at this circuit. And that is exactly what Red Bull started to suspect. Because every time Verstappen exited the final hairpin and accelerated onto the long straight, the RB22 looked slower than expected. At first, engineers thought it might be drag. Then they looked at the energy deployment. And that is where the data started becoming uncomfortable. The system appeared to be running out of electrical deployment earlier than planned. In other words, the car was losing hybrid assistance before the end of the straight, which explains the strange acceleration Verstappen was feeling. But here is where things become much more interesting. Because this exact issue had already appeared 1 week earlier, at the season opening race in Australia. And what happened there may now explain everything that unfolded in China. But to understand why that strange behavior worried Red Bull so much, we need to go back 1 week. Australia, the first race of the 2026 season. At the time, the headlines focused on something else. The chaos, the crashes, the dramatic comeback from Max Verstappen. But inside the Red Bull garage, a completely different story was unfolding. Because the weekend revealed the first serious weakness of the new RB22. It started with Isaac Hadjar. The rookie was running his first race distance in the new car, trying to build confidence with the new hybrid systems. Then suddenly, everything failed. Smoke, loss of power, and the car stopped. The Ford power unit had suffered a catastrophic failure after only 11 laps. For a brand new engine project, that kind of moment immediately triggers concern. Not just about reliability, about understanding. Because modern Formula One engines are not simply engines anymore. They are extremely complex hybrid systems. Energy recovery, battery management, electrical deployment, thermal limits, all working together. If even one element of that system is not perfectly calibrated, the driver will feel it instantly. Sometimes as vibration, sometimes as instability, and sometimes as disappearing power. After the race in Australia, Red Bull tried to calm the situation. They described the failure as isolated, a rare technical issue, something that would not repeat itself. But engineers knew that early season reliability problems are rarely random. They usually point to deeper integration challenges. And that is exactly the type of challenge Red Bull faces in 2026. Because this year marks a completely new chapter for the team. For years, their success came with Honda Power. That partnership created one of the most dominant periods in modern Formula One. But the new regulation era forced Red Bull to build something different. A new power unit structure, a new hybrid architecture, and a new technical collaboration with Ford. On paper, it looked extremely powerful. Red Bull providing the chassis expertise. Ford contributing advanced hybrid technology. But projects like this are never simple in their first season. Integration takes time. Understanding takes mileage. And the RB22 has barely completed 1,000 kilometers of competitive running so far. That is almost nothing for such a complex machine. Which means every lap still produces new data, new discoveries, and sometimes, new problems. Now return to China. When Verstappen exited the final hairpin during sprint qualifying and accelerated onto the long straight, he felt the same strange behavior again. The car hesitated. The acceleration faded. The power delivery did not feel consistent. For a driver like Verstappen, that sensation is impossible to ignore. Because elite drivers feel energy deployment almost like a rhythm. They know exactly when the electric boost should arrive. Exactly how long it should last. Exactly how the car should accelerate. When that rhythm breaks, something is wrong. That is why the radio message sounded so sharp. Because to Verstappen, this was not just a bad lap. It was a pattern. The same strange power behavior. The same energy inconsistency. And if that pattern continues during the race, the consequences could become far more serious than a disappointing qualifying position. Because Shanghai punishes energy problems more than almost any other circuit on the calendar. Long straights, heavy braking zones, and constant transitions between harvesting and deployment. Which means if the RB22 cannot manage its energy perfectly, then Red Bull may face a much bigger problem than anyone expected this early in the season. And this is where the situation becomes even more uncomfortable for Red Bull. Because the data from sprint qualifying in China revealed something that teams hate to see. Not just a slow lap. A performance gap that looks structural. When the final times appeared on the screen, the numbers were brutal. George Russell took pole position for the sprint. The Mercedes looked calm, balanced, fast in every sector. Meanwhile Max Verstappen finished 8th. More than 1.7 seconds slower. Isaac Hadjar ended the session in 10th place, more than 2 seconds away from the fastest lap. In modern Formula One, that kind of difference is enormous. It means the car is not simply missing a small setup adjustment. It means something deeper is wrong. But the way Red Bull arrived at that result makes the situation even more worrying. Because the team barely survived the earlier qualifying segments. During the first session, both Red Bulls were already close to elimination. Drivers from midfield teams were suddenly appearing in the same time window. And that forced Verstappen to push much earlier than planned. Then came the second session. And the tension inside the Red Bull garage increased even more. Again the RB22 struggled to find pace. Again the lap looked messy. Small corrections, unstable traction, and strange acceleration on the straights. When the timing screen updated, the result shocked the engineers. Red Bull advanced to the final session. But only by less than a tenth of a second. Less than a tenth. For a team that once dominated qualifying by half a second or more, that is a completely different reality. Inside the cockpit, Verstappen already understood something important. This was not just a bad lap. The car simply did not have the pace. So when the final session began, the objective changed. Instead of fighting for pole, the goal became damage limitation. Max pushed anyway. Fresh tires. Maximum attack. The first corners looked aggressive. He carried speed into the long opening spiral. The rear moved slightly. He corrected it. Then came the slow section before the back straight. One of the most critical traction zones in Shanghai. Verstappen went full throttle. And that is when the RB22 revealed its biggest weakness. The acceleration did not arrive cleanly. The hybrid boost faded earlier than expected. And halfway down the long straight, the lap was already gone. At that moment Verstappen understood something every driver fears. The car was not just slow. It was unpredictable. Because when the energy deployment is inconsistent, the driver cannot trust the acceleration zones. You brake earlier. You hesitate on throttle. You lose rhythm. And in Formula 1, rhythm is everything. That is why the radio message sounded so cold. Not dramatic. Not emotional. Just direct. The power disappears. Again. A simple sentence. But inside the Red Bull garage, that sentence carried enormous weight. Because if the hybrid system is still behaving like that after 2 race weekends, then the RB22 may still be far from its real operating window. Meanwhile their rivals are already performing. Mercedes looks extremely strong with the new regulations. McLaren appears stable and competitive. Even Ferrari, despite their own struggles, seems more consistent on the straights. Which means Red Bull suddenly finds itself in a position it has not experienced for years. Chasing. Instead of leading. And that leads to the most uncomfortable question of all. If the RB22 is already struggling this much after only 2 races, what will happen when the championship battle truly begins?